There are ruins that speak, not with voices, but with silence, with empty windows that once held crystal, with marble halls where footsteps no longer echo, with gardens that forgot the hands that planted them. And in the rolling countryside of the American Northeast, there stands one such ruin. A mansion so grand, so impossibly ambitious, that even in decay it commands attention. Stone towers rise like broken crowns against the sky. Staircases lead to nowhere. Ballrooms built for 500 guests have hosted nothing but dust and ghosts for over a century. This was supposed to be America's Versailles. Instead, it became America's most expensive mistake. In the golden decades of the early 20th century, when railroads minted millionaires overnight, when steel barons ruled like kings, when entire fortunes were built on the backs of immigrants and the blood of industry, one man decided that wealth alone wasn't enough. His name was Alistair Remington, and he wanted something that money couldn't quite buy: immortality. Not the kind that comes from charitable foundations or political legacy. He wanted the kind carved in stone, the kind that tourists would visit centuries after his death, the kind that would force the world to remember that he existed. So he built a palace, not a mansion, not an estate, a palace, 100 rooms, imported Italian marble, French ironwork, murals painted by artists who had once worked for European royalty, gardens designed to rival Versailles itself. It was meant to be the crown jewel of the American empire, a monument to prove that the New World could match the grandeur of the old. But ambition, as history has shown again and again, doesn't care about your bank account. Because while Alistair Remington dreamed in marble and gold, reality was quietly doing the math. And the numbers didn't lie. Every redesigned wing, every imported chandelier, every expansion that he couldn't resist adding at the last moment, they were all bricks in a foundation built on something far more fragile than stone. They were built on borrowed time. And when the markets collapsed in 1907, when fortunes evaporated overnight, and America's industrial titans discovered that their empires were made of smoke and credit, Alistair Remington's dream didn't just crack, it shattered. The estate that was supposed to secure his legacy became the thing that destroyed it. Today, the mansion sits frozen in time, a monument not to greatness, but to excess, to hubris, to the danger of building faster than reality can support. Locals avoid it, historians study it, urban legends haunt it. And behind every crumbling stone lies a question that echoes through the empty halls. How does a man with unlimited wealth build something so magnificent and lose everything in the process? This is the story of Alistair Remington. A railroad heir, a dreamer, a man who believed he could outrun fate with architecture, and the palace that consumed him. To understand the mansion, you must first understand the fortune that built it. And to understand the fortune, you must go back to the railroads. The Remington family didn't inherit their wealth from European nobility or colonial land grants. They forged it, quite literally, from iron, coal, and the relentless expansion of America itself. Alistair's grandfather, Thomas Remington, arrived in Pennsylvania in the 1840s with a surveyor's education and an instinct for geography that bordered on prophetic. While others saw empty valleys and dense forests, he saw corridors, trade routes, destiny mapped in topography. He bought land, then more land, then railway rights that everyone else thought were worthless. By the time the Civil War ended, the Remington rail line stretched from the coal mines of Pennsylvania to the shipping docks of New York Harbor. Freight contracts poured in. Industrial expansion demanded his services. The family name became synonymous with infrastructure itself. By the 1880s, newspapers called them the Quiet Empire, not as flamboyant as the Vanderbilts, not as ruthless as the Rockefellers, but just as wealthy, perhaps more so. And into this world of silent, calculated power, Alistair Remington was born in 1869. He was the heir, the golden child, the one who would inherit an empire worth billions in today's currency. But wealth, he learned early, was not the same as respect. The Remingtons were new money, industrial money, the kind that smelled of coal dust and engine grease no matter how many silk suits you wore over it. The Astors looked down on them. The old Dutch families of New York barely acknowledged them. Invitations to the most exclusive gatherings arrived late, or not at all, and young Alistair, raised in luxury but starved for validation, felt every slight like a knife. His father was a cold, calculating man who measured success in tonnage and profit margins. Conversations at the dinner table revolved around freight schedules and labor disputes, not art or culture or legacy. But his mother, Eleanor Remington, a woman who had married into industry but never surrendered her refined sensibilities, whispered different dreams into her son's ear. Money fades, she told him once, standing in their Fifth Avenue drawing room, staring at a painting she'd purchased from a European auction. But beauty outlasts empires. The Remingtons must be remembered, Alistair, not just counted. He never forgot those words. At 16, he was sent to Europe for his education, a tradition among America's new aristocracy, an attempt to polish the rough edges of industrial wealth with continental sophistication. He studied in England, toured France, spent a summer in Vienna, absorbing the grandeur of imperial palaces. And everywhere he went, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He walked through Versailles and wondered why America had no palace to rival it. He stood in the gardens of Schönbrunn and asked himself why the New World's wealthiest families still lived in mere houses. He began filling journals, not with business plans or investment strategies, but with sketches, floor plans, architectural fantasies, notes about ceiling heights and marble types and the exact way sunlight should fall through stained glass. His classmates thought he was eccentric. His tutors thought he was distracted. But Alistair was neither. He was obsessed, because he had realized something that would define the rest of his life. The Remingtons had money. They had power. They had influence, but they had no monument, no structure that would force history to remember them. No palace that would stand for centuries as proof that they had existed and mattered and deserved to be spoken of in the same breath as European royalty. And if his father wouldn't build it, if his father was content to be remembered in ledgers and profit reports, then Alistair would do it himself. He returned to America in 1897, 28 years old, newly in control of a significant portion of the family fortune, and burning with a singular vision. He began searching for land, not in New York where the Vanderbilts had already claimed their territory, not in Newport where the summer palaces of the elite dotted the coastline like pearls on a string. He wanted wilderness, raw, open land where his estate could rise without competition, where it could be seen for miles, where visitors would have to journey to witness it, making the pilgrimage itself part of the legend. He found it in the rolling countryside of the Northeast, thousands of acres of forests, meadows, and hills that seemed to exist solely to cradle his dream. The locals were stunned when he bought it. Newspapers ran headlines calling it Remington's Folly before a single stone was laid. But Alistair didn't care. He hired architects, the finest in the country, gave them a mandate that made them pause and glance at each other, unsure if he was serious. Build me something that will stand for 1,000 years, something that makes Versailles look modest, something that proves America can create beauty that rivals anything Europe ever built. They asked about budget. He told them there wasn't one. They asked about timeline. He told them to begin immediately. And in 1898, with 300 workers and a vision too grand to be contained by reason, construction began. What followed would be one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic private building projects in American history. But in those early days, as the foundation was poured and the first stones were laid, none of that mattered. Because Alistair Remington stood on the hilltop where his palace would rise, looked out over the land that would soon hold his dream made real, and believed, truly believed, that he was building his immortality. He had no idea he was building his tomb. Construction began on a morning in May, and within weeks, the countryside transformed into something between a medieval cathedral site and an industrial battlefield. Hundreds of workers arrived daily. Stonemasons from Italy, iron workers from France, German carpenters who specialized in ornamental woodwork so intricate it looked like frozen lace. Entire crews were brought across the Atlantic with contracts that promised years of employment and wages that made other laborers jealous. The scale was incomprehensible. The original master plan called for a central palace with 2 massive wings extending like arms from a grand entrance hall. Guest pavilions would dot the surrounding landscape. Gardens inspired by Versailles would stretch across acres of sculpted terrain. A private railway spur would bring visitors directly to the estate's gates. It was ambitious. It was achievable. And Alistair Remington couldn't leave it alone. 3 months into construction, he ordered the ballroom expanded, not by 10 feet, by 40. He wanted a space that could host 500 guests beneath a ceiling painted to resemble the Sistine Chapel. The architects protested. The structural changes would require tearing down work already completed. He didn't care. Rebuild it. 6 months in, he decided the entrance hall wasn't grand enough. He'd seen photographs of a Baroque palace in Prague with a staircase that spiraled upward like a sculpture. He wanted that, exactly that. The engineers explained it would require importing a specific type of marble from Carrara that was already allocated to another project. He bought the quarry. By the end of the first year, the estate had consumed more raw materials than some entire towns. Trainloads of limestone, shiploads of marble, forests worth of imported wood. Stained glass windows commissioned from studios in France that had once created pieces for cathedrals. The workers called it the palace that couldn't make up its mind, because every few months Alistair would arrive with new sketches, new ideas, new visions that required tearing down and rebuilding what had already been completed. A gallery wing was redesigned 3 times before the walls were even finished. A dining hall that seated 100 was expanded to seat 150, then redesigned again because Alistair decided he wanted a ceiling mural depicting the 4 seasons, which required additional height and structural reinforcement. He installed an organ in the music room, not a modest one, a cathedral-sized instrument with pipes so large they had to be built into the walls themselves. It cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He commissioned a series of murals from an artist who had worked in European palaces, then rejected them halfway through because the colors didn't feel regal enough. The artist quit. Alistair hired another, and through it all, through the constant revisions, the spiraling costs, the frustration of workers who saw months of their labor undone on a whim, the estate grew. Not logically, not efficiently, but magnificently. The central palace rose like a crown against the sky. Towers reached upward, topped with copper roofs that would age to green. Carved stone framed every window. Balconies stretched across facades like stages waiting for royalty. Inside, the grandeur bordered on absurd. A grand staircase carved from a single type of Italian marble took 8 months to complete. The banister alone required 6 artisans working in rotating shifts. The ballroom floor was inlaid with wood from 12 different countries, mahogany, teak, oak, walnut, creating patterns so complex that guests would later say they spent more time looking down than dancing. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls. Some held over 2,000 pieces of hand-cut crystal. Raising them into place required scaffolding, pulleys, and teams of men working for days. The library was designed to hold 30,000 books, most of which Alistair hadn't purchased yet, but planned to acquire from European estates. Staff quarters were built to house 200 servants. Kitchens were equipped with the latest technology. A heating system, revolutionary for its time, was installed throughout, powered by the estate's own coal furnaces. Greenhouses were constructed for tropical plants and by orchids that required year-round controlled temperatures. Ornamental lakes were dug by hand, fountains imported from Italian villas, hedge mazes planted with plans that would take a decade to fully mature. And the cost? The cost was becoming a problem no one wanted to discuss. Contractors began noticing delays in payment. Not long delays, just enough to be unusual. Enough to make foremen nervous. Rumors spread among the workers that Remington had begun quietly selling off minor assets. A smaller estate here, a warehouse there. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise eyebrows among those who paid attention. Because while the Remington fortune was vast, it was not infinite, and the estate, this impossible, ever-expanding dream, was devouring money faster than the railroads could generate it. But Alistair refused to acknowledge it. When his financial advisors suggested scaling back, he dismissed them. When his father, now elderly and watching from a distance, wrote letters urging restraint, Alistair ignored them. Because admitting the estate was too expensive meant admitting he had miscalculated, that his dream was larger than his fortune, that the monument he was building to prove his greatness might actually prove his foolishness. And he couldn't accept that, so the construction continued. One winter, after a heavy snowstorm revealed that the roof lines of two completed wings that didn't align symmetrically when viewed from a certain angle, Alistair ordered one wing demolished and rebuilt. The architects were stunned. The workers were outraged. But the orders were given, and the wing came down. Months of labor, thousands of dollars of materials, gone, because the symmetry wasn't perfect. By 1905, the estate was nearly complete, and the Remington fortune was nearly gone. Not bankrupt, not yet, but strained in ways that would have terrified anyone paying attention. The problem was this: Alistair had built a palace. But palaces aren't just expensive to construct, they're expensive to exist. The estate required a small army of staff to maintain. Heating bills alone could have funded small businesses. Repairs were constant. Grounds upkeep was never-ending. He had built something so grand that it could not sustain itself. But he had also built something undeniably magnificent. When the estate opened for its first private viewing, a carefully orchestrated event for select members of high society, even his harshest critics fell silent. They walked through halls that seemed to stretch into infinity. They stood beneath ceilings painted by masters. They gazed at ballrooms that rivaled anything Europe had ever built. And for one perfect moment, Alistair Remington had exactly what he wanted: their awe, their envy, their acknowledgement. But perfection, as he would soon learn, is the most fragile thing a man can build. Because while champagne was poured and orchestras played in his unfinished palace, the world outside was already beginning to shift. Markets were tightening. Credit was drying up. The age of unlimited industrial fortunes was quietly entering its final act. And the estate, glorious, impossible, magnificent, had become an anchor. The collapse didn't announce itself with trumpets or headlines. It came quietly, like frost creeping across a window, like the first crack in a foundation that no one notices until the entire structure begins to shift. For Alistair Remington, the end began in October of 1907. It started with a single telegram delivered to his estate office, a message from his financial manager in New York. The wording was careful, diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Markets unstable, railroad stocks falling, recommend immediate liquidation of non-essential holdings. Alistair crumpled the telegram and threw it in the fireplace. He had weathered financial storms before. Everyone had. The American economy was volatile. It rose and fell like the tides. This would pass. It always did. But this time was different. The panic of 1907 wasn't a gentle correction. It was a financial earthquake that shook the foundations of American industry. Banks collapsed. Credit evaporated overnight. Stock prices plummeted so fast that fortunes built over decades disappeared in hours. And the Remington Empire, built on railroads, freight contracts, and borrowed capital, was caught directly in the blast radius. Within days, railroad stocks that had once been considered rock-solid investments became nearly worthless. Freight contracts were canceled as businesses went under. Loans that had seemed routine suddenly came due, with interest rates that bordered on predatory. And every creditor, every bank, every business partner who had once competed for the Remingtons' attention now circled like sharks, smelling blood. Alistair's financial advisors arrived at the estate in a convoy of automobiles, their faces grim. They spread ledgers and reports across the very dining table where he had once hosted society's elite. The numbers were brutal. The estate had cost more than triple the original estimates. Maintenance expenses were bleeding the remaining capital drumming, the constant revisions, the demolished wings, the imported materials. Every indulgence had compounded into a financial catastrophe. And now, with the markets in free fall and the railroad income collapsing, there was no cushion, no safety net. One advisor spoke the words everyone else was thinking: you need to sell the estate immediately while there's still value. Alistair looked at him as if he'd suggested burning down a cathedral. This estate, he said quietly, is the only thing that matters. Everything else can be sold, but not this. So he began the desperate mathematics of survival. Smaller properties were liquidated at a loss. Artwork purchased for the estate was auctioned off. Paintings that had cost fortunes now sold for fractions of their value. He mortgaged portions of the railroad lines, took loans with interest rates that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He canceled hosting plans, dismissed staff, stopped construction on the final unfinished wings. But it wasn't enough, because the estate wasn't just a one-time expense. It was a living entity that consumed resources constantly. The heating system alone burned through coal at a rate that staggered even the workers who tended it. The gardens required year-round maintenance. The marble halls needed constant cleaning. The imported orchids in the greenhouses would die without precise temperature control. Every day the estate existed, it devoured more money, and every day Alistair had less. His wife, Margaret, a woman who had married him for love but stayed for the dream of what they might become, began spending more time in her private wing. She stopped attending the few social events they still hosted, stopped walking the gardens she had once adored, stopped pretending that everything would be fine. She would sit by the tall windows overlooking the unfinished eastern wing, staring out at the construction equipment that had been abandoned mid-project, and say nothing when Alistair entered the room. One evening he found her there and tried to explain. "It's temporary," he said. "Once the markets stabilize, the markets aren't the problem." "Alistair." She didn't turn around, just kept staring at the frozen construction site. "The problem is that you built something you can't afford to keep, and you're choosing it over everything else." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that the estate was their legacy, that it would all make sense in the end. But the words stuck in his throat, because deep down he knew she was right. His health began to deteriorate. The sleepless nights accumulated. The stress carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. His hair, once dark and thick, turned gray seemingly overnight. He developed a cough that doctors couldn't explain, or perhaps didn't want to, knowing it was born of stress and grief rather than disease. Old allies in society began avoiding him. Invitations stopped arriving. The same people who had once marveled at his estate now whispered about his decline at parties he would never attend. The newspapers, which had once called his estate Remington's Folly as a joke, now used the phrase with genuine pity, and still he refused to sell. Because selling would mean admitting defeat, admitting that his dream, the monument he had built to prove his worth, to force history to remember him, had been a miscalculation. That the palace designed to immortalize him had instead destroyed him. By 1909, the situation had become untenable. The banks demanded payment on loans he couldn't cover. Creditors threatened legal action. The remaining railroad holdings were seized to cover debts. The Remington Empire, 3 generations of wealth, power, and influence, crumbled like a palace built on sand. And the estate, that magnificent, impossible dream, was mortgaged so heavily that Alistair no longer truly owned it. The banks did. Margaret left on a gray morning in November. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbye. She simply packed what she could carry and walked out through the grand entrance hall, past the imported marble, past the cathedral organ, past the ballroom where 500 guests had once danced, and disappeared into a life he would never be part of again. He didn't try to stop her. He stood at the window of his private study, watching her car pull away down the long tree-lined drive, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the hollow realization that he had traded everything, his fortune, his marriage, his health, his legacy, for a building. And the building had won. Alistair Remington lived 2 more years. Not in the grand palace he had built. The banks had taken control of that. He was allowed to occupy a single wing, a guest apartment in his own estate, while lawyers negotiated the sale of a property no one could afford to buy. He died quietly in 1911, in a modest bedroom overlooking the gardens he had bankrupted himself to create. No obituary in the major papers, no funeral procession, no mention that he had once been one of the wealthiest heirs in America. Just a quiet notation in the death records. A name, a date, nothing more. And the estate? The banks tried to sell it, failed, tried to convert it into something profitable, failed again. The cost of maintaining it was astronomical. The cost of completing it was impossible. So it sat, empty, unfinished. a monument to ambition that had consumed everything in its path. A palace built to last 1,000 years that couldn't survive 20. After Alistair Remington died, the estate became a problem without a solution. The banks that had seized control of it quickly discovered what he had learned too late. A palace isn't just expensive to build, it's nearly impossible to abandon. They tried to sell it as a single property. No buyers emerged. The asking price was astronomical, and the annual maintenance costs would have bankrupted most families who could afford the purchase. They tried to auction off pieces, the chandeliers, the imported marble, the organ, the artwork that remained. Some sold, most didn't. The cost of removing and transporting items outweighed their value. They tried to simply walk away, but local authorities refused. The structure was too large, too prominent. It couldn't just be left to decay without someone held responsible for its maintenance and safety, so the estate sat. And the decades passed. And with each passing year, the mansion transformed from a monument to ambition into something stranger. A cautionary tale, a curiosity, a ghost. In the 1920s, a hotel consortium attempted to convert it into a luxury resort. They lasted 18 months before admitting defeat. The heating system was too complex, the rooms too oddly shaped, the location too remote to attract consistent guests. In the 1930s, during the Depression, there was brief talk of converting it into a government training facility or military headquarters. Inspectors toured the property, took notes, and left shaking their heads. The cost of bringing it up to code would exceed the cost of building something new. In the 1940s, a private school expressed interest in purchasing the estate for a boarding academy. The idea lasted until they calculated the insurance costs for housing children in a building with unfinished wings, structurally questionable towers, and a heating system that required a full-time staff to operate. Every attempt failed, and with each failure, the estate sank deeper into decay. Windows broke and weren't repaired. Roofs leaked. Water damage spread through walls like disease. Ivy crept across stone facades that had once gleamed. Gardens became forests. Fountains filled with stagnant water and debris. Staff quarters built to house 200 servants stood empty, filled only with the sound of wind whistling through broken glass. The grand ballroom, the one Alistair had expanded 3 times, that had hosted society's elite in its one perfect moment, sat silent and dark. Dust settled on the floor where guests had once danced. The ceiling mural, painted to resemble heaven, began to peel and fade. The organ in the music room fell silent, its pipes corroded by moisture and time. But the estate didn't disappear. It haunted. Local children grew up with stories about Remington's ruin. They whispered about the mad heir who built a palace he couldn't afford, about the wife who left him, about the fortune that evaporated like smoke. Some claimed they could hear music at night, faint orchestras playing waltzes in ballrooms that had been empty for decades. Others swore they'd seen lights in the towers, though there was no electricity and no caretakers. Urban explorers, teenagers daring each other to trespass, would sneak onto the grounds at dusk. They'd photograph the crumbling stonework, the empty halls, the marble staircases leading nowhere. They'd leave before dark, because there was something about the place that felt wrong. Not haunted in the supernatural sense, though the stories persisted, but haunted by waste, by loss, by the weight of a dream that had crushed the dreamer. In the 1960s, architectural historians rediscovered the estate. They came with cameras and notebooks, documenting what remained before time erased it completely. They studied the construction techniques, the imported materials, the ambition visible in every unfinished wing. Their reports called it America's Lost Palace, a symbol of the Gilded Age's fatal combination of unlimited wealth and unchecked ego. Some compared it to the unfinished royal palaces of Europe, monuments to rulers whose reach exceeded their grasp. Others simply called it a warning, because the estate embodied a truth that every era has to relearn. That wealth without discipline is just fuel for a spectacular fire. That legacy built on ego rather than substance crumbles faster than stone. That you cannot outrun time with architecture. The Remington name, once spoken alongside Vanderbilt and Carnegie, faded from memory. Business schools stopped teaching about the railroad empire. History textbooks allocated a footnote at best. The estate became more famous than the man who built it. And even that fame was a kind of infamy, the notoriety reserved for disasters and miscalculations rather than achievements. By the turn of the 21st century, the mansion had been partially demolished. Some wings were too dangerous to leave standing. Others collapsed on their own, tired of bearing the weight of a dream that had died a century earlier. What remains today is a skeleton. Towers still rise against the sky, though their copper roofs have turned green with age. Some walls still stand, covered in ivy and graffiti. The grand entrance hall, once meant to welcome royalty, now welcomes only weeds growing through cracked marble floors. Historians visit, photographers, urban explorers with cameras and a taste for melancholy beauty. They walk through what's left and try to imagine what it must have been like in that one perfect moment, when the chandeliers glowed, when orchestras played, when Alistair Remington stood in the center of his creation and believed he had built something that would outlast time itself. But mostly they see the ruins, and ruins have a way of speaking truths that finished buildings never can. This estate was never meant to be lived in. It was meant to be seen, to impress, to dominate, to force acknowledgement from a world that had dismissed its builder. And it succeeded in a way. People remember it, but not as Alistair intended. They remember it as America's most expensive mistake, as the palace that consumed a fortune and destroyed a dynasty, as proof that ambition without restraint is just another word for self-destruction. The final lesson of the Remington estate isn't about architecture or wealth or even legacy. It's about the difference between building something great and building something meaningful. Alistair Remington wanted to build a monument that would force history to remember him. He succeeded, but history remembers him as a warning, not a hero, as the man who mistook excess for greatness, who confused scale with significance, who believed that if he built something grand enough, beautiful enough, impossible enough, the world would have no choice but to acknowledge his worth. And in the end, the only thing the world acknowledged was his fall. Today, if you visit the land where the estate still stands, or stood, depending on which wings have collapsed since the last inspection, you'll find a place caught between existence and erasure. Not quite ruins, not quite preserved, just fading, like a photograph left in sunlight too long. Like a name written in sand at the edge of the tide. Like a dream that cost everything and left nothing but the memory of its price. Alistair Remington built his palace to outlast time. But time, as it always does, outlasted him. And all that remains is the story, a warning carved in stone and regret, a reminder that no matter how high you build, how much you spend, how grand your vision, if the foundation is ego rather than purpose, the whole thing collapses, every time. He wanted to build America's Versailles. Instead, he built America's greatest warning.